Good afternoon. It's Thursday, March 31st, and this is IBA News broadcasting from Jerusalem. Opposition leader Isaac Herzog has found himself embroiled in a suspected corruption scandal. The Zionist Union chairman is being questioned by police over allegations of wrongdoing during labor primaries 3 years ago, where he ran against Shali Yachimovich for leadership of the party. Authorities are looking into possible campaign financing violations. The initial probe, which was authorized by the Attorney General, has not yet reached the level of an investigation. For his part, Herzog has defiantly denied any wrongdoing, saying that he welcomed the examination and that he will fully cooperate. At the same time, he accused the Likud of so-called frustrated activists of conducting a political smear campaign against him. He said they already tried to besmirch his name before the elections and that he already denied them back then. Herzog is the second major political figure to come under scrutiny by police in the past 48 hours. Yesterday, it was revealed that Shas leader, Interior Minister Aryeh Deri, is also being questioned over possible corruption allegations involving real estate. Deri, who already served time in jail in the late 1990s on charges of bribery, said he too will cooperate with authorities in a bid to clear his name as soon as possible. Details of both probes are barred under court order, gag order. B'Tselem says that Stringer in Hebron, who filmed an IDF soldier shooting a wounded Palestinian stabber last week, has been called in for questioning by police. Far-right Israeli activists filed a police complaint against Imad Abu Shamsia on Saturday night, alleging that he had conspired with two Palestinian stabbers who attacked soldiers in the West Bank city of Tel Rameda. Jewish extremists Itamar Ben-Gvir and Ben-Zion Grubstein, leader of the anti-Arab Lahavia organization, filed a police complaint, noting that B'Tselem's activist was on the site near the attack to film the incident just minutes after the two Palestinians carried out the stabbing attack. Meanwhile, at this hour, the shooting soldier is appearing before a military court for the third time to hear a request by military police to extend his remand. Reports indicate that the prosecution is expected to reduce the charges from murder to manslaughter. The United States has strongly condemned a UN Human Rights Council resolution calling for the creation of a blacklist of companies operating in Judea and Samaria. The resolution, initiated by Palestinians and approved with no countries voting against it, requests that UN human rights officials set up a database of all business enterprises that have enabled them to profit from growth in Israeli settlements. Earlier, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu denounced the resolution, saying the international body had turned into an anti-Israel circus, which ignores the blatant human rights violations of Iran, Syria, and North Korea. State Department's John Kirby said the United States unequivocally opposes the move and accused the Council of bias against Israel.
The United States strongly and unequivocally opposes the very existence of Agenda Item 7. It is the Human Rights Council Agenda 7 that's entitled Human Rights Situation in Palestine and Other Occupied Arab Territories, but it's specifically directed at Israel. So we continue to unequivocally oppose the very existence of that agenda item and therefore any resolutions at the HRC that come from it. We consistently raise our staunch opposition to the Council's bias against Israel. It does not serve the interests of the Council to single out one country in what we believe to be an unbalanced manner. We are concerned about this resolution, calling on the HCR to implement a database of businesses operating in the settlements. And as you know, we strongly oppose Israeli settlement activity in the occupied territories. We continue to view it as eroding the prospects for a two-state solution. However, the creation of such a database, as called for, would be what we, in our view, an unprecedented step by the Council.
Prime Minister Netanyahu also reacted sharply to a letter from U.S. Senator Patrick Leahy and 10 other Democratic members of Congress who called for an investigation into alleged extrajudicial killings of Palestinians. The group addressed the letter to Secretary of State John Kerry, urging that if allegations prove to be true, military aid to Israel should be suspended. The letter also called for a similar probe into rights violations in Egypt. Leahy's letter came as a bit of a surprise to many since he is considered a strong supporter of Israel. It is also noteworthy because he has also signed on an American law that conditions U.S. military aid to countries whose security forces don't violate human rights. Responding to the letter, Netanyahu said the IDF and Israel police do not engage in executions. He said Israel's security forces defend themselves and innocent civilians with the highest moral standards against bloodthirsty terrorists who come to murder them. Netanyahu questioned, where is the concern for the human rights of the many Israelis who've been murdered and maimed by savage terrorists? He added that the letter should have been addressed instead to those who incite youngsters to commit cruel acts of terrorism. We should mention, however, that the American letter was issued last month prior to the Hebron shooting incident and was not related to the matter. Security forces overnight demolished the home in Hebron of the Palestinian terrorist who murdered 41-year-old Gennady Kaufman in a stabbing attack next to the Cave of the Patriarchs in December last year. Kaufman was critically wounded in the attack and succumbed to his injuries several weeks later. The terrorist was shot and killed by security forces at the scene. It's Thursday, and joining us now in the studio to shed some light on the top stories of the week is Hamot Sassael, a senior columnist for the Jerusalem Post and the Dow Jones Market Watch. Hamot,
how are you?
We have corruption in Israel. We've got the head of the Zionist Union, Isaac Herzog, being investigated or questioned about corruption charges. Aryeh Deri, the head of Shas, also. What is the impact of this political corruption?
Well, there is a qualitative difference between the two men's political positions, and it is that Aryeh Deri is uncontested as his party's leader and, in fact, as its embodiment, whereas Isaac Herzog is contested, and, in fact, as we're talking, all the many would-be successors or unseaters of his are jockeying for what they hope will be a very imminent contest, which makes us in the media suspect that the very leaking of this situation, of the allegations against Herzog, comes in this context and from the vicinity, at least, of one of his opponents, which leads you to the substance of the allegations. In Herzog's case, in my view, it sounds unlikely that someone as wise as he is universally seen would return to the scene of his previous implications. Right. In other words, what he did in 1999 when he was assisting Ehud Barak and he was implicated in some campaign financing violations, which he later, of course, was not indicted for, but nevertheless was not convicted for, it is unlikely that he would return to that kind of scene and do the same kind of felonies. So I therefore suspect that what we're witnessing here is some kind of an intrigue against him. Deri is a different situation. I don't know what happens there legally. Nobody knows outside of the legal system. But everybody saw yesterday a mansion house that he evidently owns, whether directly or indirectly, in addition to the expensive house he already inhabits in Jerusalem. And that makes one wonder, not legally, but just morally, how he tries to be or aspires to be the great champion of the have-nots.
Amos, if they survive this charges of political corruption, what impact is that going to have on them?
Any politician who survives this kind of allegation emerges empowered. And in Deri's case, he already enjoys right now much of the clout of which he had previously been dispossessed. So I don't know that it's going to be that much of a difference in his situation. But Herzog, if he survives this, and my hunch is that he will emerge empowered. He will be the underdog that defeated the people who tried to unfairly attack him.
Well, let's look at this week we had the Supreme Court knock down the gas deal and sort of puts the judicial branch against the executive branch. What was it that the court is looking for?
The court only saw one detail in the broad and very complex roadmap, which had to do with the government's blueprint compelling future governments for 10 years to leave intact the basic corporate structure that is in that blueprint. But having said this, more deeply, the problem here is the political infrastructure of the deal, which is that the government's majority in the Knesset is so narrow that it tried to bypass the Knesset and through executive motion execute a blueprint that the court said, at least in its one aspect, demanded legislation. So I think that this flaw in the government's game plan will now make it either reconfigure the plan or reconfigure the coalition.
Well, exactly. What are the options for Netanyahu now to
I
get
think
this
that
government?
there are outside the coalition two very natural supporters for this blueprint, Avigdor Lieberman and Yair Lapid, and that gaining their support is not insurmountable politically, whether with or without bringing them into the coalition, and I think that this is what Netanyahu will prefer to do.
We saw this week the passing in the Knesset of a bill capping the executive pay for banks and insurance companies. How's that going to help the average citizen?
I think it helps the average citizen emotionally, and that it all stemmed largely from a populist groundswell that is now global. We're living in a political time that gives rise to phenomena like Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, and we're not detached from that ecosystem. Having said this, there really was here an economic injustice. There is no economic reason for a senior Israeli banker to be paid the kind of pay that a senior American banker is being paid, not because he's less talented, but because the American bankers are managing far larger assets and in a much more competitive setting. So this was unfair, and in our zeitgeist, where social injustice is really making many people outrageous, angry, such a thing demanded alteration, and it's a shame that the bankers did not understand it by themselves. They had to be made to understand this by the Knesset.
Well, much you think that Israel is ripe for populist actions like this?
It certainly is ripe. The question is whether it can afford populism, and I think that populism is an extremely dangerous path to tread. And we Israelis in the developed world have the most fresh memories of where populism leads economically. We had hyperinflation 30 years ago. Its damage was immense. Our emergence from it was heroic, and we should never go back there.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Amos Asael, always a pleasure to have you on IBA News.
Thank you, Ari.
Upper Nazareth Mayor Shimon Gapso was today sentenced to 6 months in prison on charges of bribery and moral turpitude. The sentence was given after the Supreme Court rejected an appeal by Gapso following his conviction last year, as well as an appeal by the state which asked for a harsher punishment. Immediately after the ruling, Gapso resigned from his post and will not be able to serve as mayor for the next 7 years. The Israeli Navy this morning completed an exercise simulating the takeover of an Israeli ship by Islamic State terrorists from Sinai. All the Navy units took part in the drill, and the takeover was conducted by the Israeli naval commandos from the Shayetet 13 group, who neutralized the terrorists and freed the hostages. Israel informed both Egypt and Jordan ahead of the exercise. A senior commander in the Navy stressed that it was a routine maneuver and not related to any concrete or imminent threats by ISIS operatives in Sinai. In regional news, the London-based Al Hayat newspaper reports that U.S. Secretary of State Kerry informed several Arab countries that the United States and Russia have reached an understanding that Syrian President Bashar Assad will leave to another country as part of the future peace process, aiming to put an end to the Syria's civil war. According to the report, based on a Security Council diplomat, a timetable was not set up for Assad's departure. The understanding between the United States and Russia came about in behind-the-scenes diplomatic channels involving military operations against Islamic State, which included talks about Assad's departure. More pain at the pump. Gasoline prices will go up at midnight tonight by nearly 5.5%. The maximum price for a liter of 95 octane at the self-service line will stand at 5 shekels 84 agorot. That's an increase of 30 agorot per liter. For the past several months, gasoline prices have consistently dropped, but this latest hike is now attributed to the latest rising prices of oil worldwide. Stock talk now, and the shares on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange were down today, while the shekel strengthened against all major foreign currencies. Here's a look at the late afternoon numbers. Turning to the weather, and the IBA weather team says it's going to be a warm, sunny weekend. Here are the expected highs and lows at home and abroad for the next 24 hours. That brings us to the end of this broadcast of IBA News. I'll be back on Sunday to give you the latest news from Israel. I'm Ariel Sullivan, wishing you a great weekend and shalom from Jerusalem.